A long time in the ancient land of Judah, there lived a man whose voice would echo across centuries. His name was Isaiah. He was not a king, nor a soldier, nor a man of wealth and power. Instead, he was chosen for something far greater, to become the messenger of divine truth, warning his people of the dangers ahead and pointing them toward hope and salvation. Isaiah's life unfolded during a time of turbulence and uncertainty. Judah, his homeland, stood divided from its northern neighbor, Israel. The once united kingdom of God's people had been fractured, their bond weakened by years of conflict and disobedience. To the north, the mighty empire of Assyria was rising with terrifying speed, conquering lands and spreading fear across the ancient world. To live in Judah at that time meant to live with a constant shadow of dread, wondering if their land would be the next to fall under Assyria's crushing power. Yet within the walls of Jerusalem, life seemed deceptively stable. Kings like Uzziah had brought prosperity, military strength, and the expansion of cities. Fields yielded harvests, armies grew stronger, and monuments were built to showcase the kingdom's success. To the ordinary eye, Judah appeared to be thriving, but Isaiah saw deeper. Behind the glitter of prosperity, he recognized cracks in the nation's soul. The wealthy grew richer while the poor suffered. Injustice filled the streets, and many people turned their hearts away from the one true God, bowing instead before false idols. Isaiah's calling was not easy. He would be tasked with telling hard truths, words people did not want to hear. He would stand before kings who placed their faith in political alliances rather than in God. He would challenge the people of Judah to see beyond their comfort and to recognize the danger of their disobedience. His mission was clear: to reveal both divine judgment and divine mercy, to remind the people that though punishment might come, hope would not be lost. What makes Isaiah's story so powerful is not just the history it preserves, but the lessons it still carries for us today. It is a story of courage in the face of fear, of faith in the midst of chaos, and of a vision that reaches far beyond the boundaries of time. It is about a man who saw the holiness of God, recognized his own unworthiness, and yet found purpose in answering the call. Here, send me. If you are ready to journey through this extraordinary story, a journey of visions, warnings, miracles, and promises of hope, stay with us until the end. Together, we will uncover how Isaiah's voice, spoken thousands of years ago, still speaks to us now. Before we begin, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss more inspiring stories like this. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful lessons from history and scripture to life. Now, let us step into Judah and walk alongside Isaiah, the prophet of salvation and divine judgment. Under King Uzziah, Judah appeared to be a kingdom blessed beyond measure. The cities grew larger and stronger, walls were fortified to protect against enemies, and trade brought wealth into the markets. The people of Jerusalem could walk through the streets and see evidence of prosperity everywhere. Soldiers in shining armor training in the courtyards, merchants calling out as they sold fine goods, and farmers bringing their harvests into the bustling city. To many, this was a golden age, a time when Judah could stand proudly among the nations. Yet Isaiah, even as a young man, sensed something troubling beneath the surface. The grandeur of the city could not hide the suffering of those who lived in its shadows. The more Isaiah looked, the more he realized that the wealth of the few came at the cost of the many, that the houses rising high in Jerusalem were built while others struggled simply to find bread for their children. He began to see greed taking root, a hunger for land and power that left little room for compassion. Isaiah could not ignore what his eyes witnessed. He saw men adding house to house, joining field to field until the poor had nowhere left to call their own. He saw the arrogance of the rich who lived in luxury while widows and orphans cried for help with no one to defend them. These injustices pierced his heart, and he knew that the God who had once delivered his people from slavery in Egypt could not be pleased with such disregard for the weak. The city may have been filled with festivals and sacrifices at the temple, but Isaiah perceived that worship without justice was empty. People bowed before the altar with offerings, yet they turned away from their neighbors in need. Their lips praised God, but their actions betrayed a nation drifting far from his ways. Worse still, idolatry spread like wildfire. Carved images of false gods stood in homes and public spaces, their presence a stark reminder that many hearts had abandoned the covenant with the true God. What was once a people defined by their devotion had become fractured by competing loyalties, chasing after idols that promised security but delivered nothing but emptiness. Isaiah knew that such a path would only lead to ruin, for a kingdom cannot stand when its foundation is built on lies. His concern grew heavier each day as he watched leaders and citizens alike trust in rituals, wealth, and foreign alliances rather than in the God who had given them their land. Isaiah's soul was stirred with a restless fire. He could not look away from the suffering of the poor, nor ignore the cries of the oppressed. He understood that prosperity without righteousness was an illusion, that a nation could appear strong while rotting from within. He saw clearly that if Judah continued on this path, judgment would be inevitable. And yet, even as he wrestled with these truths, Isaiah also believed that God's purpose was never only destruction. He held on to the conviction that behind every warning lay the possibility of renewal, that beyond judgment there could be hope. But the people would not find that hope in gold, in chariots, or in the idols they worshipped. They would only find it by returning to the God who had chosen them, by learning once again to walk in justice, mercy, and humility. This awareness placed Isaiah at a crossroads within his own heart. He was just one man, living in a city dazzled by its own success, surrounded by voices that preferred comfort over conviction. How could he, a single voice, speak against the tide? What would it take to awaken his people to the danger they faced? These questions lingered in his mind, filling him with both fear and determination. He knew that a message of truth is rarely welcomed when it disturbs the illusions people cling to. Yet he also sensed that silence would be a betrayal of everything he believed in. As he walked through the crowded streets of Jerusalem, Isaiah would look at the faces around him and wonder how many of them understood the fragility of their prosperity. Did they realize that their city, no matter how fortified, could not withstand the weight of injustice? Did they see that worshipping idols and turning away from the vulnerable placed them on a path to ruin? Or were they too captivated by the glitter of success to notice the cracks forming in their foundation? Isaiah's heart ached not only because of the corruption he witnessed, but because he loved his people. He longed for them to recognize their errors before it was too late. He yearned for Judah to remember the God who had rescued them, who had given them laws not as burdens but as guides to a flourishing life. He wanted them to rediscover compassion, to restore fairness, to treat each other with dignity. He wanted them to realize that true strength comes not from armies or riches, but from walking in harmony with God's ways. The challenge before him was immense, but Isaiah's conviction grew stronger with each passing day. He knew that he could not remain a silent observer. The injustices, the idolatry, the misplaced trust in human power, these were wounds in the heart of his nation, and someone needed to speak of them. Though he had not yet experienced the vision that would fully define his prophetic calling, the stirrings of that mission were already alive within him. Isaiah was being prepared, shaped by what he saw and felt, to become the voice that would call Judah back from the brink. Thus, while others celebrated wealth and strength, Isaiah carried within him the burden of truth. His eyes were open to the reality others chose to ignore. He could see beyond the momentary prosperity to the looming danger ahead. And in that tension between outward success and inward decay, Isaiah's story truly began. a story that would challenge kings, unsettle nations, and ultimately speak of both divine judgment and everlasting hope. It was in the year that King Uzziah died, a time when the nation trembled at the uncertainty of its future, that Isaiah's life was changed forever. He had carried the burden of seeing the corruption of Judah, of watching a people who claimed to worship God yet turned their hearts toward idols and neglected the poor. He had wrestled with questions of justice, of whether his voice alone could make a difference in a society intoxicated with wealth and blinded by pride. But on that day, Isaiah was granted a vision so overwhelming that it burned itself into his soul and forever defined the course of his life. He found himself standing in the temple. Yet it was not the earthly temple of stone and cedar that his eyes beheld. Before him rose a scene of staggering majesty, the throne of the Almighty himself, high and exalted, its train filling the entire temple with a radiance that words could scarcely capture. Around the throne hovered the seraphim, beings of fire and purity, each with 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, unable to look directly upon the fullness of divine glory. With 2 they covered their feet, a gesture of humility in the presence of the eternal King. With 2 they flew, circling the throne as they cried to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory." Their voices shook the very foundations, and the temple itself trembled as if creation could barely contain the weight of that holiness. Isaiah stood overwhelmed, not merely by what he saw but by what he felt in that moment. The purity of God's presence pierced through every layer of his being, exposing him in a way that no human eye ever could. He felt the depth of his own unworthiness, the smallness of his life compared to the infinite majesty before him. The words rose unbidden to his lips, a cry of despair from a man suddenly aware of his own frailty. "To me, Ireland, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." In that confession lay the truth that Isaiah had carried in his heart for so long, that not only his people, but he himself stood guilty, tainted by sin, unable to stand in the presence of such perfect holiness. Yet God's response was not destruction. From the fiery circle around the throne, one of the seraphim flew toward him, holding in its hand a live coal taken with tongs from the altar. The glowing ember moved closer, and though Isaiah might have expected pain, what came instead was mercy. The coal touched his lips, and the seraph declared, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." In an instant, the crushing weight of unworthiness lifted. The fire did not consume him. It cleansed him. What had once made him tremble in fear now filled him with awe and hope. He had experienced the grace of God, a forgiveness that reached into the very core of his being. Isaiah's heart, once heavy with the burden of his nation's corruption, now burned with a new fire. He had seen the throne of God, heard the voice of the seraphim, and felt the purifying touch of divine mercy. As he stood in the presence of eternity, he heard the voice of the Lord himself, calling into the silence, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" The question reverberated through Isaiah's soul, echoing louder than the cries of the seraphim. It was not merely a summons for anyone, it was a call that Isaiah knew was meant for him. He had witnessed the truth of Judah's condition. He had felt the cleansing of his own sin, and now he stood ready to respond. Without hesitation, his words rose strong and clear. "Here, send me." That moment marked the beginning of his prophetic calling. No longer would Isaiah simply observe the injustice around him. He would be the voice to proclaim God's message to kings and common people alike. He knew the task would not be easy, that his words would often fall on deaf ears and hardened hearts. The people might refuse to listen. They might reject him. They might even despise him. But none of that mattered anymore. He had seen the throne of the living God. He had been cleansed by fire. And he had answered the call. His life was no longer his own, it belonged to the one who had chosen him. From that day forward, Isaiah carried within him a vision of both judgment and hope. He would speak of the danger that lay ahead if Judah continued in its rebellion, warning that their trust in idols and foreign powers would lead to ruin. Yet he would also proclaim that beyond judgment there was a promise. A remnant would remain, and through that remnant God's plan of salvation would unfold. The vision of the throne, the cry of the seraphim, the burning coal upon his lips, all of it became the foundation of his mission. It gave him the courage to confront kings, the strength to speak against injustice, and the faith to endure rejection. In the glow of that vision, Isaiah stepped into his destiny. He was no longer merely a man burdened by the corruption of his nation. He had become a prophet, a messenger, a witness to the holiness and mercy of God. And as his voice began to echo through the streets of Jerusalem and beyond, it carried with it the power of that sacred moment in the temple, a moment when heaven touched earth and a man was forever transformed. When Isaiah answered the call in the temple and declared, "Here, send me," he did not yet understand the full weight of what his obedience would require. The vision of the throne and the purifying fire had filled him with awe and courage. But now the voice of God revealed a truth that would test the very limits of his endurance. Isaiah was not being sent to a people eager to hear, nor to a nation ready to repent. Instead, he was being sent into a field of resistance, where his words would strike hardened hearts and closed ears. The Lord made it clear from the beginning. Isaiah's mission would not be crowned with quick victories or widespread applause. His voice would often echo unanswered, his message rejected, his warnings dismissed as inconvenient or unwelcome. Yet it was precisely into that silence and rejection that Isaiah was called to speak, for the truth had to be declared whether it was embraced or ignored. As he stepped into this mission, Isaiah quickly discovered the reality of God's words. He would stand before crowds in Jerusalem and proclaim the danger of their choices, urging them to turn back from injustice. But the people looked away as though his warnings were nothing more than the ramblings of a dreamer. He would remind them of the covenant they had forgotten, calling them to return to the God who had once delivered them with mighty acts. Yet their hearts remained tethered to idols carved by human hands. Even when disaster loomed on the horizon, when the armies of Assyria gathered strength and drew closer with each passing year, the people still placed their hope in political deals and foreign alliances, convinced that human power could shield them from divine judgment. Isaiah's words were clear, his voice unwavering, but most chose not to listen. The resistance was not only among the common people. Kings themselves often turned deaf ears to his message. When Isaiah confronted Ahaz, telling him not to fear the threats of his enemies and to trust in God alone, the king could not let go of his fear. He looked to Assyria for protection, sacrificing the independence of his nation in an effort to buy safety with human power. Isaiah pleaded with him to stand firm in faith, offering even a sign from God as assurance. But Ahaz rejected it, preferring the visible strength of alliances over the unseen hand of divine deliverance. For Isaiah, it was a painful reminder that even those entrusted with leadership could be blinded by doubt and fear, unable to see beyond their own strategies. Rejection weighed heavily on Isaiah, but it did not silence him. Instead, it deepened his conviction that truth had to be spoken regardless of the response. He came to understand that his role was not to measure success by the number of hearts that turned, but by his faithfulness to the calling he had received. God had warned him from the beginning that the people would resist, that their hearts would be caroused, their ears dull, their eyes closed. And yet, even in that bleak picture, there was a thread of hope. Isaiah was told that though the land would be stripped bare and the people scattered, a remnant would remain. Like a stump left after a mighty tree is cut down, life would still endure, and from that remnant the purposes of God would continue. This promise sustained Isaiah through the long years of his mission. Each time his words were ignored, he remembered that his voice was not in vain. Each time his message was rejected, he clung to the truth that God's plans extended far beyond immediate results. He understood that sometimes the role of a prophet was to plant seeds that would not sprout until generations later. That faithfulness meant trusting God with the outcome rather than demanding visible success. It was a lonely path at times, to speak and not be heard, to warn and not be heeded. But Isaiah knew that silence was not an option. He had seen the throne of God. He had been purified by fire, and he had been chosen to carry a message that no amount of resistance could erase. The weight of his mission gave his words a depth and urgency that still echo through history. He became a voice that pierced the illusions of prosperity, reminding Judah that wealth without righteousness was an empty shield. He spoke against the arrogance of nations, declaring that no empire, not even Babylon or Assyria, could stand forever against the purposes of God. He offered visions of judgment but also of hope, proclaiming that one day peace would flow like a river, swords would be beaten into plowshares, and the knowledge of the Lord would cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. And though many in his own time refused to listen, his words endured, carrying a power that would outlast the kingdoms he warned and the kings who ignored him. Isaiah's story is not simply one of rejection, but of steadfastness. It is the story of a man who discovered that faithfulness is not measured by applause or popularity, but by obedience to a higher calling. It is the story of a prophet who dared to speak when silence would have been easier, who proclaimed truth even when the crowd turned away. And in that persistence, Isaiah revealed something greater than himself: the unwavering patience of God, who continues to send messengers even to those who resist, ignore, and reject, offering mercy alongside warning, hope alongside judgment. Thus Isaiah walked his path, carrying both the burden and the honor of being God's messenger. He learned that the value of his mission was not found in how many listened, but in the certainty that he had spoken the words entrusted to him. His life became a living testimony to the truth that sometimes the greatest acts of faith are not in what we achieve, but in the courage to stand, to speak, and to remain faithful even when the world refuses to hear. As Isaiah continued to fulfill his calling, the weight of his message became increasingly clear. The people of Judah, despite living in a land blessed with fertile fields and fortified cities, were gripped by fear. Around them, the nations stirred with ambition and aggression, and the shadow of Assyria loomed ever larger on the horizon. It was in this climate of uncertainty that many sought security through human alliances rather than divine trust. They looked to Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs, whose armies and chariots had once seemed unbeatable, as a source of protection. They imagined that by aligning themselves with such power, they could safeguard their cities, their wealth, and their lives. Yet Isaiah, having witnessed the hollow pursuit of human strength among his own people, knew the peril in such reliance. He understood that no human kingdom, no matter how mighty, could truly protect Judah from the consequences of straying from God. Isaiah's warnings were not delivered as mere political commentary. They flowed from a deeper understanding of the spiritual condition of his nation. He saw that turning to foreign powers for help was symptomatic of a larger failure, a turning away from the God who had delivered their ancestors from slavery and led them to the promised land. He knew that when the kings and the leaders of Judah sought the protection of armies and alliances, they were essentially saying that God's promises were insufficient, that his power was not enough to sustain them. In the quiet of his prayers and in the intensity of his visions, Isaiah understood that such choices were not only strategically flawed but spiritually dangerous, eroding the very faith that held Judah together as a people. When he approached King Ahaz with his counsel, the stakes were undeniable. Two kingdoms, Rezin of Aram and Pekah of Israel, threatened to strike at Judah. their forces pressing close to the borders and their ambitions clear. Fear swept through the palace, and whispers of seeking help from Egypt grew louder among the advisors. Isaiah, sensing both the immediate danger and the spiritual consequences, spoke with clarity and courage. He urged the king to resist the temptation of human security, to place his trust entirely in God's provision. He reminded Ahaz that the Lord had proven faithful in the past, guiding their people through deserts, wars, and famine, and that God's protection was far superior to any chariot or alliance. Yet Isaiah's words, though passionate and filled with divine insight, met resistance. Ahaz, like many before and after him, struggled to see beyond immediate fears, his eyes fixed on the visible strength of armies rather than the unseen hand of God. Isaiah's mission in this moment required extraordinary courage. To challenge the king, to confront advisors and soldiers alike, was to risk being dismissed, ignored, or even vilified. Yet he knew that silence would be far more dangerous. The consequences of misplacing trust were not theoretical. They were tangible, and they would ripple through generations. A reliance on Egypt would lead Judah into political compromise, moral compromise, and ultimately, defeat. Isaiah understood that the people could only survive and flourish if their faith remained anchored in God, if their hearts returned to justice, mercy, and obedience rather than schemes and treaties. In the midst of this tension, Isaiah offered a vision of hope that intertwined with his warnings. He spoke not only of what could fall if they continued in fear and misplaced trust, but of what could endure if they embraced God's guidance. The lesson was subtle yet powerful. True security is not found in swords, shields, or alliances, but in aligning one's life with the purposes of the divine. To turn to God, to listen to His counsel, and to follow His ways was to access a strength that no human power could rival. This strength was not flashy or immediately visible. It required patience, humility, and faith. Yet Isaiah's conviction was unwavering. He had seen the holiness of God. He had been purified and called to serve, and he could not waver in his message, no matter how the people responded. Isaiah's warnings also carried a symbolic weight. Egypt, in his message, represented more than a foreign power. It embodied the human tendency to seek control through what can be seen and measured, to depend on alliances, wealth, or technology rather than spiritual wisdom. When Isaiah spoke against these alliances, he was teaching a principle that went beyond geography. Human efforts, no matter how impressive, cannot replace divine guidance. He illustrated this principle through vivid imagery, comparing the reliance on foreign armies to building a house on sand, knowing full well that storms would come and the foundation would crumble. Through his words, he challenged Judah to look beyond immediate comfort and safety, and to cultivate trust in what could not be seen but could be relied upon with certainty, the faithfulness of God. Throughout his ministry, Isaiah continued to repeat this message, adapting it to each circumstance and each audience. When new threats arose or when the people again looked to Egypt and other nations for security, he reminded them of God's past deliverances, invoking memories of miracles, victories, and providence. He connected the political and the spiritual, showing that decisions made from fear and self-interest were never isolated. They impacted the very soul of the nation. Those who turned away risked not only defeat but the erosion of their identity as God's chosen people. Those who heeded the message, even in small measures, discovered a resilience that no army or alliance could provide. Isaiah's warnings about alliances were not merely about politics. They were about faith, integrity, and survival. He challenged the people of Judah to reorient their priorities, to place God at the center of every decision, and to recognize that divine wisdom far surpassed human calculation. The king, the advisors, and the citizens all had to wrestle with this uncomfortable truth. The visible might of the world was nothing compared to the invisible power of God, and though many resisted, ignored, or rejected this teaching, Isaiah remained steadfast, for he had seen the throne of God, he had been purified by fire, and he knew the eternal truth that had to be spoken, even when it was unwelcome or inconvenient. Through this chapter of his ministry, Isaiah revealed a timeless lesson. The pursuit of security through human means is fragile and temporary, while trust in God provides enduring strength, wisdom, and protection. His words were a clarion call to look beyond fear, to seek divine guidance, and to live courageously with faith as the foundation of every decision. In urging Judah to place their trust in God rather than foreign powers, Isaiah not only confronted the politics of his own day, but also imparted a lesson that continues to resonate. True security and lasting peace are found not in the power of man, but in the providence of the Creator who sees beyond what we see and knows what we cannot imagine. As Isaiah continued his prophetic mission, he found himself navigating the complex corridors of kings and courts, where fear and uncertainty often clouded judgment and faith. King Ahaz, who ruled Judah with a wary eye on the mounting threats around him, exemplified the struggle between human anxiety and divine trust. The young king faced formidable enemies, Rezin of Aram and Pekah of Israel, whose armies pressed close to the borders of Judah, threatening to undo the fragile security of the nation. In these tense moments, whispers in the palace advised Ahaz to seek help from Egypt, to rely on chariots, horsemen, and foreign alliances as a shield against danger. It was a temptation that appealed to the natural instincts of any ruler, the allure of tangible power over unseen providence. Yet Isaiah, guided by his unwavering vision of goddess sovereignty, stepped forward to counsel the king with both courage and clarity, urging calm in the face of fear and complete trust in the God who had protected their ancestors through countless trials. Isaiah's message to Ahaz was not merely one of reassurance but a direct challenge to human logic and worldly reliance. He reminded the king that fear-driven decisions could compromise the nation's faith and invite disaster rather than avert it. In the midst of political tension, Isaiah spoke with prophetic authority, painting a picture of a future sustained not by swords or foreign alliances but by divine wisdom and steadfastness. The king, however, struggled to absorb these words. The immediate pressures of threats and looming battles pressed heavily upon his mind, and the visible security offered by Egypt seemed far more real than the invisible protection of God. Still, Isaiah did not falter. He repeated his counsel, grounding it in both warning and hope, emphasizing that faithfulness to God was the only foundation strong enough to endure the storms that gathered at Judah's borders. Years later, Isaiah would face another king, Hezekiah, whose heart leaned more earnestly toward God. And yet the challenges he confronted were of a different, more personal nature. Hezekiah fell gravely ill, so much so that the shadow of death seemed to descend upon him and his kingdom. In this dark hour, Isaiah approached the king not with mere words of comfort, but with the weight of divine authority, delivering a prophecy of healing that stretched beyond human expectation. Put your house in order, Isaiah warned, for the king's life teetered on the edge of mortality. Yet God's mercy intervened, and in a miraculous sign that defied natural law, time itself seemed to bend in response to prayer. The shadow on the sundial moved backward 10 steps, a visible testament to God's power and willingness to alter the course of human events for those who sought him in faith. This moment with Hezekiah served as a vivid reminder of the unique relationship between God and his chosen leaders, highlighting how trust and obedience could invite divine intervention in ways that surpassed ordinary understanding. Isaiah's role in these events was not merely as a messenger of abstract principles, but as a bridge between the divine and the human, a conduit through which God's power and mercy flowed into the lives of kings and Through them, the nation itself, the lessons for both Ahaz and Hezekiah were intertwined. Fear and reliance on human schemes could lead to disaster, but faith and obedience opened the door to protection, guidance, and even miraculous restoration. Isaiah's interactions with these two kings exemplify the delicate balance he maintained throughout his ministry. With Ahaz, he faced a ruler resistant to trust, pressed by fear and worldly logic, and he spoke words that required immense courage, because their wisdom was not immediately apparent to those who heard them. With Hezekiah, he witnessed the profound effects of faith when the king's heart aligned with divine will, demonstrating that God's intervention could bring healing, hope, and restoration in tangible and astonishing ways. In both scenarios, Isaiah's steadfast presence and unyielding commitment to God's message highlighted a central theme of his prophetic life: that human vulnerability and divine purpose intersect in moments where obedience and faith can transform outcomes beyond human comprehension. Throughout these events, Isaiah's counsel was rooted not in political strategy or military might, but in spiritual insight and moral clarity. He taught that real leadership required more than strength and alliances. It demanded courage to trust in God, clarity to discern right from wrong, and patience to wait for divine timing. The sundial's reversal, a sign given to Hezekiah, was not merely a miracle for one man's benefit, but a symbol of God's ability to alter history when hearts are aligned with His will. Similarly, his warnings to Ahaz were not only cautionary tales for one king, but enduring lessons about the perils of substituting human wisdom for divine guidance. In recounting these stories, one sees the consistency of Isaiah's mission: to call kings and commoners alike to recognize the futility of relying solely on human strength and to embrace the power and wisdom of God. He showed that fear, whether in the halls of the palace or in the hearts of ordinary people, could be countered with faith and courage. He revealed that divine intervention often came in ways that challenged natural expectations and human understanding, requiring openness to the extraordinary. And he exemplified the patience and perseverance needed to deliver God's message in a world that might resist, reject, or fail to comprehend its significance. Through the lessons with Ahaz and Hezekiah, Isaiah illustrated a timeless truth: the greatest victories are not won by armies, alliances, or human ingenuity alone, but by hearts aligned with God's purpose, willing to trust and act in faith even when circumstances seem impossible. His life, entwined with the fates of these kings, becomes a vivid testament to the power of divine guidance, the importance of obedience, and the profound impact a single faithful voice can have when it speaks the truth boldly and consistently. Isaiah's counsel to the rulers of Judah reminds us that in times of fear, uncertainty, and crisis, the path to safety and restoration lies not in the visible forces of the world, but in unwavering trust in the one who governs all creation with wisdom and love. As Isaiah's ministry unfolded, his vision extended beyond the borders of Judah, reaching into the heart of the surrounding nations whose power and pride threatened to overshadow God's people. He saw empires rising and falling, cities bustling with wealth and ambition. Yet he understood a truth that the kings and generals of those lands failed to grasp. No empire, no matter how mighty, could escape the authority of the Lord Almighty. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, with its towering walls, bustling markets, and armies that seemed invincible, appeared untouchable in the eyes of the world. Yet Isaiah, guided by divine insight, saw its fate clearly. He raised his voice, calling out to the people of Judah to witness a truth that would challenge their fear and reshape their understanding of power. Babylon, which seemed destined to reign eternally, would one day fall, not by human rebellion alone but by the sovereign will of God, a force far greater than any sword or chariot. Tyre, the wealthy city perched on the coast, thriving through maritime trade and the accumulation of riches, was another target of Isaiah's prophetic warning. He painted a vivid picture of its fate, describing the eventual desolation that would come, the destruction that would sweep through its streets, and the emptiness that would replace its former grandeur. The merchants and rulers, proud of their influence and security, could not comprehend that wealth and cunning alone could not shield them from divine judgment. In Isaiah's declarations, the message was clear. Pride and reliance on human strength are fleeting, but God's authority is eternal. He reminded Judah that the same God who protected and judged them also held every nation accountable, and that the fate of foreign powers served as a lesson in humility and trust. Egypt, with its ancient legacy and armies that had once shaped the destiny of nations, was also a focus of Isaiah's words. He foresaw that the reliance on human might, the faith placed in chariots and alliances, would ultimately fail when measured against God's plan. Isaiah's warnings were precise, describing how even the most storied kingdoms would not escape the consequences of their actions. It was not mere political prophecy. It was a declaration that God's justice and authority extended over all the earth, from the smallest village to the grandest palace. No nation could stand outside his reach. No ruler could operate beyond his judgment, and no human strategy could nullify the sovereignty of the Lord. In delivering these messages, Isaiah often employed imagery and vivid narrative to make the warnings resonate. He described cities turned into heaps of ruins, once thriving ports now silent and abandoned, and mighty armies crushed not merely by their enemies, but by the will of a God whose plans transcended human understanding. These images were not meant to inspire despair alone. They were meant to awaken awareness, to remind Judah that reliance on human power without trust in God was a dangerous path, and to illustrate the ultimate futility of pride and arrogance. Isaiah's words carried a dual purpose: to warn the nations and to instruct his own people in humility, faith, and reliance upon divine wisdom. The judgments Isaiah proclaimed also included a thread of hope for those willing to listen. He emphasized that while God's authority brings accountability, it also offers the possibility of restoration for those who turn toward him. The nation's fall served as both warnings and lessons, illustrating that justice is inevitable, yet mercy is available to those who seek it. Isaiah's insight was not limited to immediate political events. He saw the long arc of history and how divine sovereignty shapes the destinies of nations and peoples alike. This broader perspective allowed Judah to understand that their survival and prosperity were not determined solely by military might or alliances, but by alignment with God's will and adherence to his commands. Through his prophecies about Babylon, Tyre, Egypt, and other nations, Isaiah conveyed a timeless truth. Power is temporary, glory is fleeting, and even the mightiest empires are subject to the will of God. He demonstrated that divine authority surpasses every human institution, every throne, and every sword, revealing a world in which justice, mercy, and sovereignty are inseparable. The message extended beyond geopolitical warnings. It became a spiritual lesson for Judah and for generations to come, teaching that God's hand governs the course of history, and that human pride cannot stand against divine judgment. Isaiah's ministry required courage beyond measure, for he confronted not only his own people but also the imagined invincibility of foreign empires. His words were often ignored, resisted, or misunderstood, yet he remained steadfast, driven by a vision of God's justice and a calling to speak truth regardless of human response. He understood that prophecy was not about immediate acclaim but about faithfulness, and that delivering God's message sometimes meant confronting mighty powers that seemed untouchable, whether they were nations or kings who thought themselves secure. In highlighting the fate of these powerful nations, Isaiah also reinforced a message to Judah. The security of a people is not found in comparison to others, in emulation of their strength, or in envy of their accomplishments. True security, prosperity, and survival come from aligning with God, obeying his commands, and trusting in his sovereignty. The rise and fall of empires were not random. They were guided by a divine hand that measures justice, enforces accountability, and ultimately fulfills promises. Through his warnings, Isaiah provided both caution and guidance, showing that God's authority is absolute, and that his people, if faithful, could navigate the dangers of their time with confidence in his enduring power. Isaiah's declarations about the nations were more than historical prophecies. They were enduring lessons about the nature of power, the certainty of divine justice, and the ultimate supremacy of God's will. He revealed a universe in which no human ambition could escape scrutiny, where no wealth could replace righteousness, and where no empire could endure outside the boundaries of divine oversight. In these prophecies, Judah found both warning and hope, learning that faith, obedience, and trust in God provide the only sure foundation amidst the shifting tides of history and the transient might of human kingdoms. Through the voices of judgment and foresight, Isaiah made it clear that God's authority was not limited to any single nation or era. Babylon, Tyre, Egypt, and all the surrounding lands were part of a larger tapestry, each thread subject to the divine loom. And as Judah listened, sometimes with understanding, sometimes with reluctance, they were reminded that their own choices, like those of the empires around them, carried consequences, and that the sovereignty of God would ultimately prevail over all. Isaiah's words, though spoken thousands of years ago, continue to echo, teaching that no power is beyond God, no empire immune to justice, and that his authority shapes the world in ways both visible and unseen. Amidst the turbulence of kingdoms, wars, and the rise and fall of empires, Isaiah's visions often turned toward a future that transcended immediate political concerns, a future imbued with hope, restoration, and the promise of redemption. As he walked through the streets of Jerusalem, witnessing both the splendor and the inequities of his city, Isaiah felt compelled to look beyond the present turmoil and perceive a deeper narrative unfolding, a story of God's plan to reconcile humanity to himself. Within this vision, Isaiah spoke of a figure unlike any other, one whose life would bear the weight of the world's suffering, a person who would endure pain and affliction not for personal gain, but for the salvation and healing of others. This prophecy, steeped in both mystery and clarity, conveyed a profound message about the nature of divine love and justice, offering a glimpse of a redemption that would not be won through swords or political maneuvering, but through sacrifice, compassion, and unwavering obedience to God's will. Isaiah described this figure with vivid imagery, painting a picture of one who would suffer quietly, yet powerfully, on behalf of those who had erred, faltered, or been oppressed. He spoke of wounds inflicted not because of wrongdoing, but because of the sins and transgressions of others, a life taken up in the service of others, forgiveness and restoration. In a time when kings and nations were obsessed with power, dominance, and survival, Isaiah's words introduced a radical vision of strength rooted in humility and endurance. This suffering servant, as he described, would be misunderstood and rejected, yet through that very suffering, the brokenness of humanity could be healed. The imagery was striking and unforgettable, a person oppressed, afflicted, and yet silent in the face of accusation, bearing burdens far greater than could be imagined, and in doing so, becoming the vessel through which God's mercy and grace flowed. As Isaiah spoke, he did not merely provide a distant or abstract prophecy. He offered a narrative that illuminated the meaning of justice, mercy, and divine purpose. The people of his time, surrounded by the intrigues of kings, the pressures of war, and the allure of material security, could scarcely comprehend the full significance of such a figure. Yet Isaiah's words planted seeds of understanding that would bear fruit centuries later. in describing one who would be pierced for the transgressions of others, who would be crushed for iniquities. Isaiah revealed that suffering could be transformative, that pain could become a channel for divine forgiveness, and that one life devoted to righteousness could ripple through generations, altering the course of history and bringing hope to the despairing. The prophecy of the suffering servant was intertwined with themes Isaiah had emphasized throughout his ministry: the necessity of justice, the peril of reliance on human might, and the enduring faithfulness of God. Just as he had warned Judah not to place trust in chariots, armies, or foreign alliances, he now pointed to a spiritual truth of even greater magnitude: that the ultimate salvation and healing of humanity would not be achieved through human power, but through divine intervention, manifesting in selfless love and sacrifice. Isaiah's words invited his listeners to envision a reality where God's justice and mercy intersected, where wrongdoing and oppression were confronted not only by judgment, but also by the healing touch of a life laid down for others. In the broader context of Isaiah's ministry, this prophecy offered profound hope. Judah had faced repeated threats, exile, and moral decline. Yet Isaiah's vision of the suffering servant signaled that divine purposes extended beyond temporary political circumstances and immediate national survival. The promise was that God's plan encompassed both judgment and redemption, that suffering was not meaningless, and that God could bring restoration through unexpected channels. This figure's suffering would embody the reconciliation between human frailty and divine holiness, providing a way for God's people to experience forgiveness and renewal even in the darkest times. The imagery Isaiah employed was deliberate and evocative. He spoke of one despised and rejected by men, familiar with pain and sorrow, yet through whose wounds others would find peace. He described an innocent life burdened with the consequences of collective guilt, a person who would absorb the weight of punishment meant for others. The vividness of this portrayal was both unsettling and comforting, illustrating the depth of God's commitment to justice and mercy. For Isaiah, the suffering servant was a beacon of hope amid the despair of Judah, a promise that God's plan was not thwarted by human sin or the cruelty of empires but would unfold according to divine wisdom and love. Christians later recognized this prophecy as pointing to Jesus, seeing in his life, death, and resurrection the fulfillment of Isaiah's vision. They understood that the suffering servant's mission to bear suffering, offer forgiveness, and provide healing was realized in Jesus' ministry, where acts of compassion, sacrifice, and redemption transformed countless lives and offered a pathway to spiritual restoration. For Isaiah, the prophecy itself was both a warning and a consolation, warning that sin and injustice carried consequences, yet consolation that God's love would ultimately prevail through a chosen instrument, bringing salvation to those willing to receive it. Isaiah's message extended far beyond the immediate crisis of his own era. Through the figure of the suffering servant, he conveyed a timeless principle: that love expressed through sacrifice can bring healing to the broken, that divine purpose often manifests through unexpected suffering, and that the most profound power lies not in dominance or wealth, but in the willingness to bear burdens for the sake of others. His words challenged the pride of nations, the hubris of rulers, and the complacency of individuals, reminding all who listened that redemption often arrives in forms that defy worldly expectation. In contemplating the prophecy, one sees a continuity with Isaiah's larger ministry. Just as he had called Judah to trust in God over human alliances, to seek justice over convenience, and to embrace faith over fear, he now pointed toward the ultimate manifestation of God's plan in one who would bear suffering for the sake of humanity. This figure embodied the culmination of divine justice, mercy, and love, offering a model of righteousness that transcended time, culture, and circumstance. Isaiah's vision encouraged his contemporaries and continues to inspire countless generations, highlighting that in the midst of pain, chaos, and moral decay, God's redemptive purpose remains at work, and through acts of selfless love, healing and forgiveness are made possible. Through this prophecy, Isaiah demonstrated the enduring power of vision and faith. He showed that even when nations rise and fall, when kings and empires seem invincible, and when humanity falters under the weight of sin, God's plan unfolds with precision, mercy, and hope. The suffering servant stands as a testament to this divine orchestration, a promise that redemption and healing are within reach for those willing to trust in God's wisdom, embrace His guidance, and recognize that true strength often emerges from humility, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in the One who holds all creation in His hands. As Isaiah's prophetic journey progressed, his visions extended far beyond the immediate crises and moral failings of his own people, reaching toward a future that was at once both tangible and transcendent, a future in which God's purposes would be fully realized across the earth. Amid the warnings of judgment, the fall of empires, and the consequences of human pride and sin, Isaiah revealed glimpses of a hope that could not be extinguished, a promise that God's justice and mercy would ultimately prevail. Central to this hope was the idea of a faithful remnant, a portion of God's people who would survive trials, remain true to divine principles, and embody the enduring covenant between God and Israel. This remnant was not merely a political or cultural survival. It was a spiritual core, a group whose fidelity to God's ways would ensure the continuity of His promises and serve as a beacon for generations to come. Isaiah's words conveyed that even in the darkest times, when corruption, idolatry, and violence seemed to dominate, God's plan was not thwarted, for the faithful remnant would remain, a living testament to His guidance and protection. In envisioning the remnant, Isaiah intertwined the themes of restoration and renewal, speaking of a time when the brokenness of Judah, the desolation of nations, and the wounds inflicted by sin and injustice would be healed. He depicted cities rebuilt, homes restored, and lives transformed, offering a vision of God's people returning to their intended purpose with hearts aligned to divine will. This restoration was both physical and spiritual, encompassing the land itself, the structures of society, and the moral and religious life of the people. It was a holistic renewal, showing that God's care extended to every aspect of human existence, from the governance of kings to the treatment of the poor and vulnerable, from the cultivation of fields to the flourishing of communities. Isaiah's vision reassured the faithful that even when adversity struck, God's restorative hand was at work, shaping a future that would surpass all human expectations. Perhaps one of Isaiah's most profound and enduring images was that of universal peace, the transformation of instruments of war into tools of sustenance and creation. In his prophetic vision, swords would be beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and nations would no longer train for war nor wield the implements of destruction against one another. This imagery was not merely symbolic. It represented a radical reordering of human priorities, a world in which conflict and violence would give way to cooperation, cultivation, and the shared pursuit of life-giving endeavors. Isaiah painted a picture of a global society harmonized under divine guidance, where human ingenuity and energy would be devoted to growth, creation, and sustenance rather than conquest and domination. The vision of peace among nations was a cornerstone of his message, reminding the people that God's ultimate plan transcended the cycles of war and power struggles that seemed to define history, pointing instead toward a future of reconciliation and collective flourishing. Isaiah also looked forward to an even grander vision, one that embraced cosmic renewal, the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. In this ultimate restoration, the former troubles and failures would not simply be erased. They would be transformed, transcended by a creation that embodied divine perfection and justice. In this renewed world, sorrow, pain, and death would no longer hold dominion, and the faithful remnant, along with all who aligned themselves with God's will, would dwell in a realm of harmony and delight. Isaiah's depiction of this new creation was not only a promise of physical renewal, but also a spiritual one, suggesting that God's purposes encompass both the material and moral dimensions of existence, offering a vision in which justice, mercy, and joy are fully realized. This prophetic imagery served as a source of hope and encouragement, reinforcing the message that God's ultimate plan is one of comprehensive renewal, where suffering is addressed, evil is corrected, and the faithful experience the fullness of divine care. The intertwining of these themes, faithful remnant, restoration, peace among nations, and cosmic renewal, provided a coherent framework within which Isaiah's warnings, admonitions, and calls to repentance could be understood. While the people of Judah faced immediate threats from foreign powers, internal corruption, and social injustice, Isaiah reminded them that these trials were not the final word. God's vision extended far beyond temporary setbacks, and through perseverance, repentance, and faith, the people could participate in a grand narrative of redemption. The remnant, preserved through faithfulness, would be the seed from which restoration grew, and the moral and spiritual renewal of the nation would serve as a foundation for broader peace and cosmic renewal. Isaiah's imagery of a new heaven and new earth, alongside the transformation of weapons into tools for cultivation, also offered a profound lesson on the potential of human alignment with divine will. The prophetic vision suggested that when humanity seeks justice, peace, and reconciliation, it participates in the unfolding of God's purposes, contributing to a world that reflects divine wisdom and care. The faithful remnant, then, was not passive, it was an active participant in God's plan, modeling righteous behavior, fostering harmony, and embodying the hope of restoration for others. In this sense, Isaiah's message was both spiritual and practical, inspiring action in the present while pointing to the ultimate fulfillment of divine promises. Throughout these visions, Isaiah consistently linked the immediate with the eternal, showing how present choices and behaviors have implications that echo into the future. By maintaining fidelity, seeking justice, and embracing God's guidance, the people of Judah could partake in the renewal he foretold, experiencing both individual and collective transformation. The prophetic vision encompassed both warning and hope, warning against disobedience, injustice, and idolatry, while simultaneously offering encouragement that God's plan for restoration, peace, and cosmic renewal was unwavering and all-encompassing. Isaiah's message, rich with imagery of remnant, restoration, global peace, and a renewed creation, continues to resonate across time, reminding us that the trials of the present are temporary, that faithful perseverance is meaningful, and that God's ultimate plan encompasses both human history and the fabric of creation itself. His words challenge individuals and nations alike to live in alignment with divine principles, promising that through faithfulness and trust, a future of justice, harmony, and enduring joy is not only possible but assured. Isaiah's visions invite us to see beyond immediate circumstances, to trust in God's sovereign plan, and to participate in the unfolding of a world where swords become plowshares. Justice prevails, and creation itself rejoices in divine renewal. As Isaiah's life and ministry drew to its later years, the lessons he imparted became clearer and more profound, not only for the people of Judah, but for all who would later encounter his words. Throughout his life, Isaiah faced immense opposition, from powerful kings who doubted his messages, from corrupt leaders who ignored his warnings, and from a populace often reluctant to change. Yet through every challenge, Isaiah remained steadfast, guided by the vision he had seen in the temple and the calling that God had placed upon him. He continued to speak truth, even when it was unpopular or uncomfortable, delivering messages of warning that exposed injustice, pride, and idolatry, but also offering messages of hope, restoration, and salvation for those willing to listen and turn their hearts toward God. Isaiah's courage in the face of resistance is a lesson in unwavering faith. He demonstrated that true leadership and prophetic ministry require perseverance, even when the immediate results are unseen or when others respond with skepticism or hostility. Time and again, he reminded the people of Judah that relying on human alliances, political maneuvering, or material wealth would not save them. Only trust in, adherence to his guidance, and the pursuit of justice and righteousness could bring lasting protection and peace. His warnings against the allure of foreign powers, the temptation to exploit the vulnerable, and the worship of false gods were not merely admonitions but calls to realign with God's purpose, emphasizing the need for moral courage in the midst of societal pressures. Yet Isaiah's message was not solely one of judgment. He spoke with compassion and foresight, revealing the hope that lies beyond the trials of life. He described the faithful remnant who would survive hardships and remain committed to God, illustrating that even in times of despair, God preserves those who are steadfast in faith. He painted visions of future restoration, where desolate lands would bloom again, cities would be rebuilt, and communities restored to harmony and justice. He spoke of global peace, where swords would be beaten into plowshares and nations would pursue cooperation rather than war, reminding humanity that God's ultimate vision extends beyond immediate struggles to a world shaped by justice, mercy, and reconciliation. Isaiah even foresaw a new heaven and a new earth, a creation renewed in joy, safety, and divine presence, where suffering and sorrow would be no more, and where God's promises would be fully realized. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Isaiah's ministry was his ability to convey that judgment and hope are inseparably intertwined. He warned of consequences for sin, injustice, and pride. Yet he paired each warning with the assurance of God's enduring mercy and the potential for renewal. Through his prophecies about the coming suffering servant, Isaiah offered a vision of forgiveness and healing, a glimpse of one who would bear the burdens of others and restore humanity to wholeness. Christians later recognized this prophecy as fulfilled in Jesus, whose life, sacrifice, and teachings exemplified the very principles Isaiah had foreseen: selflessness, love, and the power of God to bring healing and salvation to a broken world. Isaiah's legacy is also a testament to the importance of courage in speaking truth, regardless of the personal cost. His symbolic acts, such as going barefoot and stripped as a sign against Egypt and Cush, reflected the radical obedience and commitment required of a prophet who is called to challenge the norms, expose wrongdoing, inspire change. His life reminds us that meaningful action often requires stepping outside comfort zones, embracing vulnerability, and standing firm in convictions even when others turn away or resist. The persistence, faith, and integrity Isaiah displayed continue to inspire those who seek to live with purpose, justice, and alignment with divine principles. Today, Isaiah's words resonate far beyond the historical and cultural context in which they were spoken. His calls for justice encourage us to care for the marginalized and to act with integrity. His visions of peace and restoration inspire hope in times of despair, and his unwavering faith in God offers a model for courage in the face of uncertainty and adversity. Whether through personal reflection, community action, or spiritual devotion, the lessons from Isaiah's life provide guidance and encouragement, reminding us that even in the most challenging circumstances, faithfulness, perseverance, and hope are powerful tools for transformation. As we reflect on Isaiah's ministry, it is clear that his message is timeless, that God's authority surpasses all human power, that justice and mercy are inseparable, and that hope can endure even in the darkest times. Isaiah's life encourages us to embrace courage in speaking truth, compassion in addressing injustice, and faith in the enduring promises of God. His story is not only a historical record but a living guide, teaching that every act of faithfulness contributes to the broader tapestry of God's work in the world. Thank you so much for watching this journey through the life and ministry of Isaiah, the prophet of salvation and divine judgment. If you were inspired or moved by his story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends and family so that more people can experience the lessons of courage, justice, and hope that Isaiah continues to teach. Your support helps us bring more inspiring content like this to everyone who seeks wisdom and encouragement through biblical stories. Now, as the day comes to a close, may the lessons of Isaiah guide your heart toward courage, faith, and hope. May you find peace in the midst of challenges and trust in the enduring care of God. Good night, and sleep well, knowing that even in the darkest moments, light, guidance, and restoration are always within reach.